Defence Secretary, can I take you back 12 months and 2 weeks ago when you said that the Russian invasion of Ukraine, quotes, is highly likely. They could, quotes, launch an offensive at any time, and there's a whiff of Munich in the air from some in the West. Are we going to be sitting here talking about this war in another 12 months?
I think we will. I think Russia has shown a complete disregard not only for the lives of the people of Ukraine, but for its own soldiers. You know, we are sitting here 12 months in, and 188,000, actually more now, Russian soldiers are dead or injured as a result of this catastrophic miscalculation and aggression by President Putin. And you know, when someone's crossed the line that think it's okay to do that to your own people and is running effectively a meat grinder for an army, I think he's not going to stop.
So another 12 months, and then another 2 years, another 3. Do you have any sense of when the conflict might end?
Well, I think we see signs of when the Russian army can't manage to do anything else or do very much more. So I think, you know, his original ambition last February the 24th was to capture 8 main objectives, all the big cities, in 3 weeks. And he would have Kyiv in 3 days, and it would all be over. Well, his 3-day offensive has turned into a 365-day offensive, and still not captured or held a single one of his objectives. The only objective he did capture was Kherson, which he then had to leave a few months ago. So I think, you know, I think the goal of a occupied, invaded, fully controlled Ukraine of Russia has failed already. I think he's failed in the long run. The reputation of the Russian army is in tatters, and he's isolated in the world. Even the Chinese are pretty sort of, it's like the embarrassing uncle. They don't really want to speak to him. And he's committed, 97% of his army is committed to this Ukrainian war. He's lost 2/3 of his tanks and 188,000 people.
Let me tell you, or run by you, something that John Bolton, the former US National Security Advisor, says, which now it's time for NATO to stop congratulating themselves and actually move to finish this off, to have a plan to help Ukraine. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think, first of all, this is not a NATO operation. NATO's role in this conflict has merely been to get its own borders ready and defended, because ultimately, if this conflict spills over or Putin lashes out, it will be into a NATO country. And therefore, we need to be ready as our alliance, the alliance of 30 countries who do, in vast numbers, outweigh Russia in land, sea and air. And the response you've seen, which is remarkable, the international response, is a sort of concoction of bilateral members. Yes, lots of NATO members, but also countries like Ireland have helped. A very traditional neutral Ireland have helped in non-military supply. Countries from right across the world, South Korea. When I had a donor conference, I think 2 days after the invasion, I chaired a donor conference. I had 24, I think, nations. I had one the following week, it was 32. And then the Americans took over and it got to over 50.
If we talk a little bit more about NATO, do you see a day when NATO aircraft, I stress NATO, not RAF aircraft, would be flying over Ukraine airspace?
Not in the short or medium term.
Why?
Because NATO is not going to enter into this conflict.
Supplied by NATO, though.
Supplied by NATO, yes. Yeah, I could see, well, there's already talk about, I think, a country in the Eastern European country supplying MiGs, 29s. Remember,
will that be this year? Will NATO-supplied aircraft enter that?
So we just have to be careful about the NATO brand, because Putin wants to say this is a NATO invasion of his country, or NATO is trying to surround us and attack us. And if you remember, in July 2021, Putin wrote an article saying, you know, we're basically surrounded by NATO, which I replied in January last year that in his essay, it was only 6% of Russia's border had NATO on it. It's a bit sort of, well, I mean, if you think that's surrounded, then, you know, the people of as I think I said at the time, Stalingrad or the people of Arnhem would have found that rather an insult. So I think we're not going to see NATO. We're going to see countries who are members of NATO potentially put in Air Force equipment or MiG-29.
Let's talk about today. We've come to an army camp in Dorset, which is all I'm allowed to say. Clearly, my listeners can hear tanks in the background. What have you seen, Secretary of State?
Well, today I've seen really incredible groups of Ukrainians training on our Challenger 2s, on our armoured infantry personnel carriers, the Bulldogs. And these guys range from all ages. I think the oldest here is 72, all the way down, so much, much older than you and I, Nick. And then right down to very young people. And
so it's the 18 to 72 club.
Well, we're in the 18 to 30, I think, you and I.
Yeah.
So they're dedicated, they're determined, they're brave.
What about the kit, Secretary of State? What about the Ajax? I read this morning that you are locked in a row with the Treasury because we haven't been paying our bills for that bit of kit, and the manufacturers are after £1.4 billion. Will you pay?
Well, interesting story, Nick.
You normally have stronger words.
Well, yeah, but because I think on the one half, yes, it is correct. We withheld payments from General Dynamics, the prime contractor, as the taxpayer would expect us to. This is a troubled program. I called it that when I became Secretary of State Defence, and I was determined to fix it. And with the help of the Army and the prime contractor, General Dynamics, we've turned a corner on that program. But we weren't prepared to pay more money into that program while it wasn't delivering. And I think the taxpayer would, and your listener would think that's a good idea.
Indeed.
Your listeners. We're not in a row. I met General Dynamics. I wanted to make sure the trials started, and the overall contract hasn't changed in the sense the sum of money hasn't changed either. So we're in a place, we've turned the corner. But I read that report, and I think it's a mixture of out of date, wrong, and also there's a small bit of accuracy in it.
Have we got a single working vehicle
You've just
that
been
could
in
be
one.
deployed?
Well, no, because it's not what we call it operational in service yet. But you've seen about 9 or 10 of them driving around today, doing their trials and testing. And when they have completed that testing, we'll get on to the next step.
So this is something that's been around for 10 years.
Longer.
Will cost £5.5 billion, and all that's come out of it so far are a few deaf soldiers who need compensation.
Well, no, not. That might have been the case before I started. But as I said, I'm going to fix that, and we have fixed it. We have started to see this turn a corner. So first of all, Nick, this was commissioned in March 2010.
Yeah, before your time. Yeah.
So it's before anybody's. I mean, a long time. And when you're Defence Secretary, you inherit loads of programs, aircraft carriers, everything else that sometimes take 20 years to make. It was in trouble. It was in trouble because it had problems on noise, as you said, the hearing, problems on vibration, and obviously we were in dispute about that, about whether what we contracted for and what was being delivered. And so I was determined to fix it. We put a lot of time and effort in it. The Army has been fantastic in doing that. And we've now got to a stage where we have fixed the problems in noise and vibration.
We think, we're not certain.
Well, that's why we're doing the trials
right
now.
Okay.
But we did the user validation trials, which they passed successfully. And then we're on track. Now, yes, there has been a delay, but the taxpayer would rightly say, well, why are we going to pay for the delay? The delay will not be paid for by us.
One of your colleagues, Mark Francois, a former Armed Forces Minister, says don't pay a further penny.
Well, we are in a contract, okay? And the worst thing would be for me is to break a contract, lose £5 billion of the taxpayers' money, and not get the Army a capability it needs. So I think we've so far got in a place where we have rectified its problems, we think. I mean, I have to say we think because we're in the middle of the trials, but to date it's going well. And those, when they're fixed, and we think we know what to do, then of course we'll fulfill the contract.
As you are campaigning for more money in a budget, and we'll talk about that if we may in a moment, do you think the cases of the Ajaxes are being used against you?
Well, I think what I would say to anyone in the Treasury or anyone else is this Defence Secretary has fixed that problem, right? So when I say, look, I would like some more funding, whether now or the next comprehensive spending review in 2 years' time, you're dealing with someone who is not only, I think about this year for the third time, delivered a balanced budget, the first time since the war, I think, we records. I don't think you've seen a defence minister or a defence budget in such a good state in comparison to history. And secondly, I've got my house in order. So I've got my house in order. Yes, there are always some problems in our procurement, but we do deliver 85% of our contracts on time and on budget. It's the big ones, the big complicated ones that always cost issues. But it's also my job and my ministerial team to make sure that our armed forces don't gold plate things or ask for things that we can't afford.
You've referenced the Ukrainians' extraordinary fighting spirit, which I've been able to see at first hand, and thank you for that opportunity. They are an amazing bunch of men and women, they really are. Can I ask, how much kit have we sent to Ukraine, and how much has it cost?
Well, we budgeted last year at 2.3 billion, and next year's will also be 2.3 billion. Some of the equipment we've given is fairly old, so its book price wouldn't be particularly valuable, like the AS-90, the long-range artillery. That's a, I think, 1989 or 1990 piece of kit. We still have it in service, but they're also a symptom of why we need to invest in our armed forces, that our army has been about 15 years out of date. It's why in 2020, when we got the new money, we invested in a new modernisation programme for the army, which is, I think, about 34 billion over the next 10 years, and that's really important.
We've sent 14 challengers, I understand, to Ukraine. Of course, President Zelensky wants many, many more. How many more will we send?
Well, for now we're doing 14, and they're joining another tank squadron from Germany, and 14, I think, maybe it's 28 or 2 tank squadrons from the US using their Abrahams, and they're joined by Greek, Canadian, and a whole range. So I think they'll be up to about 90. Well, I'm open to more British tanks. I think the key here is we've got to, first of all, make sure these tanks are crafted into a combined arms capability. They need to be woven together with the armoured infantry, and we need to then train Ukrainians to fight them that way. So what you've seen today is teaching Ukrainians how to basically drive, fire, command these. They'll come together into a troop. That's, in my day, it was 3 tanks. It might now be 4. I don't know. I might start talking about Tiger Ones. I'm that old, but so we'll work it out. And then that gets woven into squadrons and battle groups. So we need to do that, and that's really important.
But all this kit, all these tanks, how long to backfill back here in the UK?
Well, there can
only be a finite supply.
Well, we have a fleet of about 200, I think, of which, like all the countries in Europe,
anti-aircraft missiles, everything that's been deployed. We must have to ramp up production.
So again, one of the challenges that Ukraine has exposed across the West, and I wouldn't want your listener to think this is just Britain, is Britain is not the only country that since 1991 in the West has seen a drop of our GDP of defence spending. That manifests itself in less war stocks, less consistency of reordering, and so those supply chains go to sleep, as well as their manufacturing plants.
So we reawaken them.
We've reawakened them. We've
4
placed
years
orders.
To catch up. 5 years.
No. You'll be glad to know that army units have already receiving, or the army, new NLAWs, which were the ones we gifted this time last year. We had to effectively reheat or restart. I think, if my memory serves me right, some of those components for those NLAWs had been, the companies had stopped making them 5-10 years ago. So you had to find the new places to do that. We've also started on the process of more of those anti-air missiles, and they are being made as we speak.
So in 12 months' time, the army will be absolutely back up. Will be replete with what they require.
I can't tell you of every single one in 12 months' time, but some of them had good stock. Some of them have a lot of stock.
You don't recognise the fact we're 3 or 4 years behind?
I think what I would say is overall, our ammunition stocks, which were the victim of the hollowing out for the last 20, 30 years, have a long way to go. They have to catch up. But in key areas, I'm confident we have the capabilities we need. And in some areas, some of the gifting we've given to Ukraine is munitions like Brimstone. We gifted Brimstone 1, the first generation of Brimstone. They were coming out of date anyhow. So we would have had to get rid of them pretty soon.
Can my listeners feel safe in their beds tonight that the British Army, the British Air Force, the Royal Navy have got everything they need? Would it need to, God forbid, need to be deployed?
Yeah, look, first of all, they can feel safe in their beds because we belong to NATO. We belong to an alliance of 30 nations that absolutely overmatches Russia in air, sea, and land. And so you can go to sleep tonight knowing that if anyone attacked us or Belgium or Italy or the Russians came across the border into Poland, we've got 29 friends, right? And that matters.
Okay.
Secondly, should your viewers worry about the state of our armed forces? Well, I would have said before 2020, yes.
Right.
But we got 24 billion in 2020, and we are starting to spend it. The challenge is you cannot press a button and produce a tank factory, all these things, and that takes time.
We need to move to our last couple of questions. It's been reported that you are trying to get extra funding in the budget. One of your governmental colleagues today, Johnny Mercer, described you as being on a lobbying effort. The £38 billion that was in the budget is now just shy of £50 billion. I'll quote directly, "It's not credible to say the money has been taken out of defence." He goes on, "I play everyone with a straight bat. This Prime Minister as Chancellor only 18 months ago gave the biggest defence settlement since the end of the Cold War. It's not credible, again, to say we've not put money into defence." Mr. Mercer told me that yesterday morning. What would you say to him?
Well, I think, Johnny is a junior minister, and Johnny luckily doesn't have to run the budget. I have a defence budget that has to deal, like all the other budgets, with inflation, with changes to threat, and I have to just deal with that, and that's my job. When the NHS...
So he's being naive?
No. I just think, his experience is not... He's not Secretary of State. He hasn't run... I run a department of 224,000 people, I think it is, or something like that.
How big is his department?
I think he's got 12 people in the office.
And finally, as I've referenced before, you are a military man yourself. Recently, Prince Harry was in the headlines because he talked about how many people he'd been killed. How wise was that? How he had killed. How wise was that?
I think every veteran makes their own choices about what they want to talk about in their lives.
Respectfully, Secretary said that doesn't answer the question.
Well, because I think it's an individual choice.
All right, let's try it. How many people? How many members of the enemy did you kill?
I'm not going to go into those sort of things. I mean, I don't think it's mainly because the armed forces is not about a tally.
But I thought there was a sort of unwritten code that you never say. It's not something you talk about.
No, I think you'd have to ask Prince Harry his choices he make. I frankly think boasting about tallies or talking about tallies does two things. It distorts the fact that the army is a team game. It's a team enterprise. For an infanteer to go over the top, that person is supported by hundreds of people behind them, whether they're in headquarters in Britain, whether they're in the Royal Logistic Corps who help them get there. It's a team, and so it's not about who can shoot the most or who doesn't shoot the most. And I think if that's just my personal view, if you start talking about who did what you're actually doing is letting down all those other people, because you're not a better person because you did and they didn't.
And finally, did we move closer to a new Cold War with Vladimir Putin's speech in Moscow earlier this week?
I think we moved closer to a President Putin who decides that he wants to erect a wall between Russia and the West, in a symbolic wall of the West. We don't need the West. The West is bad. The West's values are bad. The West's tolerance of people's sexuality and their religions is bad, and we don't need the West. I think his speech was a view that actually isolationism is something that he seems to want to embrace, and that he's just reconfirmed all his own prejudices, but also a very, very distorted view of the world.
Okay, I've been told I've got time for one final question. Your close colleague James Heappey once said that if the budget spending isn't linked to the 3% that he demands, last October he told me he'd leave his job. Do you give me that pledge as well now?
Well, we're not into the 3% or 2.5%.
No, by 2030.
No, that's been that the government has stopped that pledge. When we had the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, it was very clear throughout that he wasn't going to do arbitrary percentages. For me, what matters most, Defence Secretary, is we get the money to fund the armed forces to keep you safe.
But if the if it's not forthcoming, there's a rather good job waiting over at NATO, isn't there, Secretary of State?
I don't know. Well, no,
Well,
I
you
don't
do
think
know
so.
the job's available, Secretary of
Well,
State.
it is available, but of course you have to have the support of your government and everything else, and we have to.
Would you enjoy the support of this government?
I think. It is not unheard of for Secretary of State in the lead up to a budget to be asking for relief from pressures that have occurred since the last settlements. It's not unheard of, and I think we'll be negotiating with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister and the Chancellor said in the autumn statement they recognise defence needs more money. We've just got to get to the next comprehensive spending review. We're not in a position where we want transformational money in the next 2 years. We'll see.
But is a NATO job something that might interest you?
Yeah, look, it is a job that is, of course, would be brilliant for someone from Britain to do. But I'm also really interested in my defence job. I love sitting here amongst the tanks and 30-odd years ago, I was here changing those tracks, doing my driver maintenance course. To spend time with some of the finest people in our country, I think is really a privilege. So I love doing this job, I think, is the answer to that.
Can I echo that? Thank you for providing me with the opportunity of meeting some of the blokes and women here. They're the best of Britain.
Thank you, Nick. Well,
thanks very much.
Thank them. Thank you.